So, Charles Darwin, born into a wealthy family in Down, England. Uh, his father was a physician, his grandfather was a physician, and he, it was hoped, would be a physician also. But he did not have a taste for medicine, so he decided to study theology instead. And while he was studying theology, he could also study natural history, which meant he could study botany and zoology and things of that nature. So, upon his graduation, he uh, came upon an opportunity to go on an ocean going voyage aboard HMS Beagle. And his principal responsibility was to be the companion of Captain Fitzroy, who was a proper English gentleman and required proper English company. So Darwin is essentially sent along to be his dining companion and to provide him with pleasant company. And at first, his parents were uh, wary of letting Charles go on this voyage. He managed to convince them that that this was meant for him. So he set out on HMS Beagle, and this voyage, its original intention was to map the coast of South America uh, so that navigation could continue in that area, trade could continue with South America. And Darwin was horribly seasick, so he got off the ship as often as he could and took advantage of the opportunity to explore, chronicle vegetation and the flora and fauna of the areas where he was let off the boat and send specimens back to England. And after their survey of South America, the Beagle continued traveling the world, including spending some time in the Galapagos Islands, which are now famous for their visitor, Charles Darwin. They continued to sail all the way around the world through New Zealand and Australia and back to England. And this was a very long voyage during which Darwin made lots and lots of observations about the natural world and got to see more than many people before him with the level of education that he had in natural history, botany and zoology and stuff like that. So here you can see the Galapagos Islands are an archipelago, a series of islands, and he discovered that a couple of things about the flora and fauna of the Galapagos Islands. One important thing was that all of these islands were populated by species that seemed to have some affinity to the South American mainland. So it seemed like these were species that had somehow come over from South America and had come to the islands, and different islands had different species upon them, but they all seem to share common ancestry within a certain lineage. So, for example, the finches that he found in the Galapagos Islands all seem to share common ancestry, as well as the tortoises and the other flora and fauna of the islands. So, what Darwin focused on was adaptation. How organisms were suited to their environment and how they were able to capitalize on whatever resources were available within a certain area. So now we know from looking at all of the finches that are present in the Galapagos Islands, and there's more than just these three, there's a couple of dozen species of finches in the islands that all have beaks that have enabled them to exploit whatever their particular niche is. So here we have a cactus-eating species. You can see it's got kind of a broad and pointy beak for picking out parts of the cactus. Here you can see an insect eater that has a beak that is like a pair of fine forceps for getting into narrow crevices and spaces and catching insects in that way. And this seed-eating finch down here, you can see has a very broad beak for exerting a lot of force upon the seeds in order to crack them open and eat the nutritious material inside. So Darwin wrote an essay on natural selection as the mechanism for evolution or descent with modification, but he did not really publicize it. He didn't introduce his theory publicly, but he continued to perform a lot of research and experiments, wrote letters to experts in the various fields of botany and zoology. And he determined that natural selection is a process where individuals that have favorable inherited traits are more likely to survive and reproduce. This is the essence of natural selection. It all has to do with favorable inherited traits and the likelihood that those are going to be passed on to progeny, and that those progeny are going to be the ones that are able to survive and reproduce. So as I said, Darwin was wary of publishing his data because he knew that it would raise a stir. It would ruffle a lot of feathers. And to this day, it continues to create something of a stir and ruffle some feathers. But he was spurred to publish because of a manuscript he got from Alfred Russel Wallace. Alfred Russel Wallace was a scientist much younger than Darwin, who was studying in the area that is now Indonesia, Malaysia, and Australia. And he had a very similar idea to Darwin that he put into a manuscript and sent to Darwin to forward to Charles Lyell. And Darwin read the manuscript and said, "Oh my goodness, this is very similar to my own idea. I really need to get my idea out there." So while Darwin didn't feel like he was quite ready to publish, he wanted to be absolutely certain that his facts were all straight and correct. He realized he had to not let the perfection be the enemy of the good, and published his tome on the origin of species. And in his book on the origin of species, Darwin explained three very broad observations, which is why all life is unified by various traits and characteristics, things that we've been studying this semester, like glycolysis, DNA, ribosomes, growth, things like that. The diversity of life. We know that there's so many different kinds of species out there in the world. Wherever you go in the world, you're going to find different organisms. And the organisms in a particular habitat are going to be very well matched to their environment. And natural selection explains why this would be so. So Darwin never actually used the word evolution in the word in that form in the origin of species. In fact, there's only one reference to evolution at all. The last word of the entire book is evolved. But he does use the phrase descent with modification, meaning that life has a unified ancestor or ancestors, and all organisms are related to each other through descent from these ancestors that lived in the the ancient past. So Darwin viewed the history of life being akin to a tree with branches spreading out on different limbs. And this was congruent with Linnaeus's view of biodiversity, or the numbers of different species out there, and that you could have many different species of oaks, for example, which were all in the genus of oaks because they had similarity to them, but we could recognize them as discrete and distinct species. So Darwin published in his journal, one of his journals, he was an extensive diarist, this particular image where he says, "I think picture. And this picture is of a tree where each of these branches represents a species that shares a common ancestor. On another branch, we might find other species that have a common ancestor. So this would be the ancestor of the genus, and the genera have ancestors at the familial level, and so on and so forth. So ultimately leading back to some ancient ancestor of all life. And to this day, evolutionary biologists still can apply this kind of tree thinking to any lineage of living organisms. We can fit that into a broader tree of life. We have not found any organism, any plant, any fungus, any bacterium, any archaean that we cannot put into the context of how it is related to other species, other bacteria, other fungi. So here, for example, is one such tree. The tree that shows elephants, the two species of African elephant and the one species of Asian elephant that are still alive today. And we can see their closest living relatives are things like these hyraxes, which are small furry creatures that live on rock outcroppings in southern Africa, and things like manatees or sea cows. But we have found fossils of many different ancestors along the way that have gone extinct within this family tree of elephants. So you can see there's pictures of what these ancestors might look like, and you might say, gosh, there are some really weird-looking elephant-like things in there. Are these figments of somebody's imagination? And they're not. Things like Platybelodon. We found fossils of Platybelodon, of Mammothus, and Stegodon. These are all fossil remains that have been found that fit very well, based on the strata that they were found in, into this story of the evolutionary history of elephants. And in some of these deeper lineages, too, you can find things like Dinotherium and many other ancestors of elephants, missing links between modern elephants and ancient elephants. And you can see that these are some of the more ancient, deeper lineages that had not so pronounced snouts and teeth like we see in our modern elephants. Another line of evidence for natural selection, as Darwin observed, was what we see through artificial selection. And this has been, artificial selection is the process of selecting and breeding of individuals that have desired traits. And all of our modern agricultural and horticultural plants and animals that humans raise demonstrate that that artificial selection is possible. So, for example, this is the slide I like to call 5 Ways to Ruin Thanksgiving. You could bring some kale or some Brussels sprouts or some cabbage or broccoli or some kohlrabi to Thanksgiving, and I will probably not eat any of these things because I don't really care for them. But the interesting thing about this slide is that they all have a single common ancestor, which is a wild mustard plant. The seeds of the mustard plant are what are ground into that paste mixed with vinegar to make the condiment that we eat. But other aspects of this plant have been selected for by humans. For example, the leaves, or the axillary buds, or the apical bud, or the flowers and stems, or just the stems. All of these things have been selected by humans to create these varieties of this one wild ancestor, the wild mustard. And artificial selection has been applied to just about any pet, any food that you can imagine. There are varieties that have been produced through artificial selection. Who knew there were so many kinds of avocados or chickens?